Hi, this is Paul again, and many of you will recognize Roland, who I had a conversation with about Jordan Peterson's visit to the Netherlands. It's good to see you again, Roland.
Yeah, good to see you as well. It's wonderful.
Now, Roland and I have been planning a conversation more about church stuff than Jordan Peterson, but after the Rationality Rules video, and the videos I made following up on that, Roland had quite a few ideas. Roland, why don't you tell a little bit about your studies, where you're studying and what you're studying?
Yeah, I just want to say one thing about the previous video. When I look back on it, I realized I didn't follow Rule 6 of Jordan Peterson, and that is set your house in perfect order before you criticize the world. So I think, honestly, I was a bit too negative and too criticizing of the churches and of the people here. I think there are wonderful people around here, and many of the churches will happily receive people, and there will always be people who think more about their faith, and others who more feel feel it. And so I didn't want to give the impression that it's just all it's just not going to work, or the people in church are not ready for you, because I really think they will love you if you try.
Well, that's been my overwhelming impression too, not just of church people, but many people around the world. So I didn't think you were too negative, but I could be a fairly negative guy. So why don't you talk a little bit about where you're going to school and what you're studying, and maybe even what you hope to do with it afterwards?
Yeah, I'm studying philosophy in a free university in Amsterdam, and currently I'm writing my thesis, my bachelor thesis, and it's not about truth, but it is about the idea of implicit bias, which some people might be familiar with. It's less of a topic here in the Netherlands as it is in the United States, as far as I can tell, but it is coming here, and it's just very interesting. It raises a lot of intriguing philosophical and conceptual and scientific questions. And well, I hope to finish that in the coming few months, and then I am probably going to do a research master here also on the Free University, and that's going to be mainly about epistemology and ethics, and the interplay between the two. And well, you get the standard curriculum of philosophy usually. So we also talked about metaphysics in courses, and about truth and analytic philosophy and continental philosophy, and all the subjects that, or not all the subjects, but most of the topics in philosophy. And so truth has always been a thing that interested me a lot. And so when I read and heard the arguments, I thought I just had to do something with it.
Well, and that's how Roland and I met initially. I started making videos, and he sent me
Yes,
some
that's true.
emails about some of the philosophical things, and had some comment on them, and so we started going back and forth. And again, because he's Dutch, and my ancestral connections to the Netherlands, I've just been having a lot of fun interactions with Roland. Now, you went ahead and made a PowerPoint, so I'm going to share the screen now, and maybe you can work through. I've already had a chance to look at this, but I thought you had a lot of really interesting stuff in it. So why don't you go ahead, and I'll interrupt you sometimes with questions.
We need to go to the first slide first. This is just a little bit too far.
What's that?
It's at the third slide. We need to go
I'm
to the
sorry.
first.
Okay.
Yeah, that's right. So you get a glimpse of the future there. This is just a kind of map of philosophy, you could say, and I think that's important because the different parts of philosophy, they can be confusing, and you can argue about one of them and just then get stuck in the second without realizing it, and that can really create a lot of confusion and bad arguments as well. So the thing is that two of the most important branches of philosophy are epistemology and metaphysics. Epistemology, as there is the study of knowledge, the theory of knowledge, and metaphysics is about ultimate reality. Now, I do want to say that the definition of metaphysics is controversial. There is no agreed upon sort of definition, but it's a pretty good summary, I would say, and I used some good sources at least. So what I'm going to explain is not, I'm just not pulling that out of my whatever. It's almost completely based on my education and on sources like the book. I can show it now, I think. Where do you have it? This book, yeah, this is Metaphysics by Peter van Inwagen. It's actually an Christian American philosopher, and he is really well respected. And so the definition is his. And so metaphysics is about what's real. What's real? So, and that's of course a very complicated question. And you can divide it up in ontology, which is what exists. So what kind of objects is mostly the question. So are there atoms? Is there an external world? So what's its nature? That kind of stuff. And there's also some less ontological questions about, for example, truth, free will, mind and body, etc. But it's still about what's really the case. That is the thing that unites them all. And well, just an important distinction, I think, is things like skepticism and scientism are not strictly metaphysical. So if you're going to argue about knowledge or about the role of science in the theory of knowledge, you're not doing metaphysics. And if you make an argument based on skepticism or scientism or anything of the like, you do need to be careful, and you cannot straightforwardly conclude that a certain metaphysical idea is false just on the basis of skepticism or whatever you want about whatever you're arguing for about knowledge. So you need to keep those two things distinct.
Okay. Now often when I think about metaphysics, basically Greek background, meta, it's beyond physics, and where truth, free will, mind, body, physics. That's why we often use, say, naturalism. Or people say the natural world. I think that's a bad way of phrasing it. The physical world, physics, chemistry, biology. And so metaphysics I often think of it as the study of what's beyond just the physical world. And that's obviously a big, big piece. So it's an interesting definition, study of ultimate reality.
Yeah, so you really want to get at the bottom of it. And well, if you go to realism and that kind of stuff, you really need to be clear about the distinctions about the words you're using. And what Van Inwagen uses, that's objective truth, and that's usually the word that professional philosophers use. And you can also call that realist truth. And it is not the same as absolute truth. Absolute truth is not a very clear term, and you can, for example, in ethics, in morality, you can talk about absolute moral commands, for example, that are valid no matter what, for example. But it doesn't really work. It's just not a very good word to talk about truth. So I think it's very important to just stick to objective or subjective, if you want another flavor of truth. And you can call that realism about truth. And what Van Inwagen says is that's basically a combination of two theses, and that's one is the correspondence theory of truth. So you have certain beliefs, assertions, whatever, and they're true or false depending on whether they represent the world correctly. So, and that's a very old and revered theory of truth. You can find it kind of in Aristotle and Plato a little bit, and Aquinas is definitely an important figure there. And so it's just the most popular, most used, and the classical theory of truth most of the time, even though it has been developed. There are many ways to cash out the different notions, but this is the basics, what you would call correspondence theory.
Okay.
And the other part is the world, so the everything that's out there, everything that exists, and that is real, so it exists, and it is independent of our minds. So that means that it's not your mind or my mind that determines the way the world is, but it's the world itself and the processes that make it up. So you can't say, and then that's basically contrary to things like subjectivism or postmodernism that tend to think that the way we think about the world really makes up the world in a sense.
Right.
But that's just so, and the first position you call metaphysical realism, and the other position, the opposed position, you could call well, metaphysical anti-realism, or well, I mean, there's several movements associated with that, but that's not that's for later, I think.
Okay.
And derived from that kind of realism, you get other kinds of realism, like moral realism, for example, about the ethics. Are moral duties, are moral values, are they objective? Again, so you use the same word. Are they real? So objective, you can read that also in the sense of, do they correspond to objects in the world, for example? So there's discussion there about objects that I won't go into. But that's a way you can read objective to make it a little bit more intuitive. And well, you have Platonic realism, you have scientific realism, which is very important actually. Many philosophers, and definitely Mr. Rationality, subscribe to scientific realism, and that's basically the claim that science describes the way reality really is, and or at least purports to do that. That's also, but I won't make it any more confusing than that.
Well, and so it sounds like, you know, if we're trying to get an idea of realism in general, its contrast, realism would be in contrast to perception. Let's say perceptionism. That the idea is that there is something exists outside of us that is beyond our perception. The difficulty, obviously, with that for human beings is the knowledge of this world. Then that's, you know, that our knowledge of this world then gets complicated because, and then in a sense we wander over into epistemology and ask about how do we know, as opposed to what is.
Yeah, but of course, I mean, you can use epistemological arguments to make a metaphysical point, but you need to be precise about it. You can't just do it like, we don't have knowledge, therefore this is false. You need to make a better argument that really transfers your epistemological concerns into something metaphysical. Right. So one important thing to note before we go to the next slide is that I mean, that truth is usually seen as a one. So all truth, it comes together, and it's not the case that you have different kinds of truths, and it also implies that truths can't contradict each other. I mean, that's logic. That's Mr. Rationality also pointed that out. It's a good point. Truth if you have one truth and another, they can't contradict each other. That's just one of the basics of that you build actually philosophy and science and any reasoning on. If you are allowed to contradict yourself, anything goes basically. So this is an important point for later on, but we will get back to that.
Okay. Okay.
And one thing, the last thing is that this kind of realism, so you could call objective truth or realist truth, wanting to often get mingled together, which is kind of be confusing, but mostly they go together. But it's not the same as naive realism. People might know the term, but naive realism is more related to the philosophy of perception. So naive realism is the idea that what you perceive is the world itself directly.
Right. Right.
So, and it is not a kind of representation of the world. So we perceive the world, not a representation. That's naive realism, but that's not the same as metaphysical realism or objective or truth realism or anything like that. That's different. But you need to keep that in the perception box.
Okay. Okay. Well, that's really helpful. That's really helpful. So let me know when you're ready to jump to the second slide.
Yeah, go to the next. Yeah. So yeah, I mean, this is basically what you would think. This sounds very logical, intuitive, right? There is a world out there. Sometimes painfully we interact with it, and it doesn't always conform to our wishes. And it also seems that there are objects out there, and if you are, for example, I didn't write it down correctly, but if there are no human beings, for example, there are no stories. Well, you need a human being as something that exists before you can have a story. And the tree example and the divorce example, there's a difference between what's real and what's good, for example. That's possible. You can, and truth is determined by the world and not by our conceptions or our ideas. That's basically it. So this idea of objective truth is just very commonsensical and popular. I think you find it in most people all over the world, and definitely in Western societies.
And I think, partly because it the idea that we all experience things that resist our wills. This all gets very complicated very quickly, especially when you introduce a new term like will. But we all experience will, and I think to a certain degree, when Peterson talks about suffering being as something which is undeniable, say looking at, let's say, a Buddhist, kind of the beginning of the Buddhist conversation in terms of, well, we know, there is this thing that we experience, frustration, vexation, we might say in older English, and this might give us awareness of truth, awareness of the world beyond ourselves, that reality isn't just one thing after another bending to our wills, that there is this broader thing that we are engaging with, and this gives us this leads us to the inevitable conclusion that we are not alone. We are not finally solipsists in this world, no. But there is something out there, and that in fact there are other minds and other beings, and we are all in this. And then there is this truth thing that these other beings are also contending with, and it all gets very complicated. But yeah.
Yeah, and what you see is that this used to be, or at least in the 16th, 17th century, people were just truth realists, or they believed in objective truth. So you get, for example, Descartes and Locke and David Hume and all these guys, Leibniz, and they basically were realists, but the problem there was that it seemed that the direction of philosophy went wrong somewhere, because you got modern science there, you got new philosophies, and I mean they all contradicted each other, Leibniz and Hume and Descartes and all of them. They just couldn't agree on almost anything, and Descartes, of course, famous for is universal doubt. And if you're going to philosophize in a realist way, then you run into skeptical problems. So how do you really know there is a world out there? How do you really know that it's the way you think it is? And how can you justify that so you have knowledge? And at the same time, you see that philosophy just doesn't make the progress that science makes, and you get a bigger popularity of materialism in the 18th and 19th century, and people are just, religion gets attacked. This is the start of the Enlightenment, I would say, and what you see is that a lot of people get really disturbed by this trend, because atheism comes up and determinism and all those kind of things, and they seem to endanger things like religion and morality. And what you see is there's a sort of a counter movement to that. And for example, Immanuel Kant, the German philosopher, he wrote that he had to deny reason, that's what he said, to make room for faith. That was one of his motivations. And Kant's system, we don't need to go into that. It's very complicated and controversial. But the idea was widespread, that this sort of materialist, scientific, atheistic philosophy was a danger for religion and morality, and morality and religion were obviously important and valuable. So there was a kind of a push to against this kind of materialist philosophy. And as you said, in these days, in contemporary philosophy, you talk about naturalism. That's quite important, because a naturalist might believe in things like Platonic objects that aren't strictly material, but they are still natural. And so you get a road to anti-realism or pragmatism, and one of the figures there is William James. He was a pragmatist philosopher, and one of the philosophers that inspired Peterson as well. And he was the guy that really wanted to reconcile science and religion, etc. And he coined the term pragmatism, and he wanted to basically escape from metaphysics, from the materialistic metaphysics of, well, there's just the things that science says there are, and that's it, and everything is determined. And he said, well, action is what matters. I mean, you hear echoes of that in Peterson, and that is basically an answer to this historical development.
It's very interesting how, how these conversations go in terms of, and this is where I get into this monarchical vision of the world, that we're always people having these conversations. And so, so even the initial distinction between metaphysics and epistemology, these distinctions are incredibly useful, and these boundaries are incredibly important to help us keep the conversation organized. But it's always, the frustration, and when you said it yourself, that philosophy is unable to progress and again, that, like, let's say, technology. It's a very interesting, if we would take a step back and say, now, why is technology and what we call science able to progress in this way, and philosophy unable to progress in this way? I mean, you would have to at some point say, well, surely there's the human factor. All these, we can create I've got my smartphone every year. LG and Samsung and Apple come out with better and better things, and this little object in my hand is pretty doggone undeniable. And the improvement of this over the improvement 3 years ago is also undeniable, and it's manifest in a sense by how we treat it and how we act towards it. And so then when you get to the turn of pragmatism, in a sense that the pragmatists are watching the philosophers and they're saying, yeah, you guys are talking, but you're reading the same newspapers, you're eating the same food, you're doing all this other stuff. And this is where, in a sense, when we get to religions, where like in America, you've got the Amish that are a descendant from German Mennonites. I mean, they, in a sense, they are very serious people in terms of, no, this is our worldview, and this is how we behave. And so to a certain degree, the pragmatists just kind of look at this and say, talk. Show me what you do, because what you do is what you really believe. And there's a lot of force behind that argument. And,
yeah, definitely. What you also see is the for example, William James and John Dewey, they think that philosophy and all those kind of talking, that it was just useless. It was a waste of time, and you never got anywhere, and people didn't even act on it. So they really thought that the knowledge should serve human purposes. So why do we care about knowledge? Well, because we want to do things, and we need knowledge to get a world to agree with us. And so it's really that kind of sort of a pragmatic mindset that just looks at the philosophers and in their ivory tower and blabbing about Cartesian demons and things like that, and they think, well, no, that's not very useful. Let's just have a conversation about the things that actually happen, that we can actually check, and that we actually act out. And at the same time, you see that in a different way, you also get the pragmatists. For example, Richard Rorty, he's also American philosopher associated with postmodernism, and he comes from a different perspective, and he thinks that the failure of traditional metaphysics, of Descartes' proof of God and all those things, and the difficulty philosophy has to prove an external world or things like that. They think, well, that just proves that realism is wrong, because if you assume realism is true, then you run into all kinds of trouble, and that doesn't make any sense. So he thinks that this kind of objective truth is just a fantasy, and that if it was really true, that we wouldn't know anything. And since we really do know anything, you can the kind of modus ponens, modus tollens arguments. You do know things, therefore realism must be wrong. So that's a way to frame a epistemological argument to get to a metaphysical conclusion.
So would you say perhaps a very low resolution take on, let's say, Rationality Matters versus Jordan Peterson would be, in a sense, we've got two proxies here of the realism camp and the pragmatic camp, in terms of why those two are bumping into each other?
Yeah, I mean, this is definitely an historical battle as well. I think Sam Harris also studied with Richard Rorty, and so you really have that tension between the two camps, and they really are fundamentally different ways of viewing the world. So you really get that this is really a deep disagreement that's underlying this kind of stuff. Even though you also at the same time you see that Peterson and Rorty are not the same thing.
Oh yeah.
Peterson doesn't like Rorty, he doesn't like postmodernism, and you could say that Rorty is a little bit more subjectivist, a little bit more relativistic. Like, well, he talks about conceptual schemes, so the way you view the world, the things, the terms you use, the concepts you use, you put that into the world and you don't get it out of the world.
Right.
So, and we all have different conceptual schemes, so we have different worlds.
Yep.
And the way that our society works is that together we construct kind of a social construction of our world. And that kind of social construction talk is extremely popular among social scientists and especially the postmodern types. They talk about everything is a social construction. You really encounter that a lot, and that's not the thing that Peterson is talking about, and we get to that in the second slide. But what you also see, just as one little note, is the thing of reductionism. So I put it down there, and that is kind of the danger that people perceive, because you get science and then it tries to explain the social world in terms of the um, psychological world. It tries to explain the psychological world in terms of the biological world. It tries to explain biology in the terms of chemistry. It tries to explain chemistry by appeal to physics, and then you get particle physics, and that's all there is, and you reduce the entire world to particle physics.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
that means, for example, that there is no real mental world. That was the idea of behaviorism. So all we have is behavior. There are no mental things anyway.
Right.
Dennett, for example, Daniel Dennett, he basically denies consciousness.
Yep.
And Harris is, for example, denies free will. And you get, it is not, it is philosophically controversial. I do want to mention that. It's not like reductionism follows from science. There are alternatives, but a lot of scientists and a lot of scientifically minded philosophers have used reductionism to get rid of the world we live in and act out, and our stories and everything, the social, the psychological. There really has been a lot of pressure to reduce that to lower levels of existence, and that creates a lot of, I mean, still, if you say, for example, right now that you don't have free will and everything is determined, that people will get angry at you. That's because you're infringing on their world. And then the free will is one, as Peterson emphasizes, free will is really essential to the way we operate. And I mean, that's a powerful motivation to look to pragmatism, to basically counter that reductionistic view of the world.
Right. And so you could argue that if the free willers all lynched the reductionists, would reductionism still exist? Or would reducing, who wins? And so I think that's exactly right. Peterson, in the tradition of the pragmatists, just looks at all this and scoffs and says, and I see this often too, if you didn't believe in free will, why would you do a podcast? That makes no sense. You have your philosophy, you can't live it out. And if you can't live it out, why have it? So
yeah, and then the counter, for example, I mean, it's still real, even though I don't believe in it. And but I think we can go to the next slide. I don't want to make it all too long. I think we're already quite far. So this is more of a discussion about pragmatism itself. What is the background? What are the ideas Peterson is basing his understanding on? And you had a few figures. Peirce and James are probably the most important. You also got Dewey, and they basically said, well, it's just about truth in the kind of grand objectivist sense. That doesn't really seem relevant and attainable. So they said, well, truth is, for example, satisfactory to believe, or the end of inquiry. So if you inquire together reasonably with enough information and enough experiment and science, for example, you can use science for that. And if you end up together at the same place and it is satisfactory, then that's truth. So you can see that it's sometimes called an epistemic theory of truth, because you define truth in terms of knowledge. So if you end up with knowledge, or if you end up with a certain view based on your epistemic justification, then that's truth. So you don't find it in terms of correspondence, but in terms of epistemic notions like inquiry or satisfactory justification. And James, for example, is very empiricist, so he says, well, true beliefs are guaranteed not to conflict with subsequent experience. That makes sense, right? I mean, if something is true, then the experience will not contradict it. And he couples that to the idea that theories and anything what we would call truth is an instrument. It's a tool, and that's important. So a truth is not something that it's not something ethereal or in the world somewhere out there. It's a tool, and that means that you don't just start with looking at the world and figuring out, well, what it is like, but you start with a certain needs, evolutionary defined needs, for example, and you need tools to um, to find your way in the world.
And to achieve, in a sense, in it. So there's a very subjectivist nature to that. There's a very a bias towards action in that. Again, that also, and this is part of why I'm using vision, that also is a certain vision of the world as opposed to this other vision of the world. And now both of these visions are going to have consequences in terms of, when you get into ethics and morality about the people over here are like, in a sense, how we started the conversation. Well, we've got metaphysics here and we've got epistemology. You better be careful about that. Well, every time anybody says better, you're speaking out of a vision of the world. And is your vision basically object oriented? Is your vision essentially more subjective in terms of, bent towards action, towards outcomes, towards will?
Yeah, and I mean, it's not like, and what is important, for example, is pragmatism is it isn't entirely subjectivistic or something. It's not just whatever you like. It needs to work, and you can do that on an individual level or on a collective level. So what works for us all, not just for me, because I might be a weirdo who wants all kinds of different crazy things, and if that works for me, it might not work for other people, which is quite logical. So
Yep.
So there's an emphasis also on coherence. So your web of beliefs, as it's sometimes called, needs to cohere. The beliefs need to support each other. They can't contradict each other, and really the emphasis on that you're fallible, and that's what Peterson calls Darwinian. You never know for sure that you got it right, and the pragmatists say, well, those realists, they really think they can figure out objective reality. That's just impossible. You always have something that is just not finished. It's just not you're not done. You're never done, and things change, and the world is chaotic, and you can really it can be quite radical, this view. So it's not just on the basis of epistemology. You also get into sort of a metaphysical theory, because what is truth, what is real, if you really define it in terms of what works, then it's difficult to still use a kind of a way for objective scientific truth, for example. So there is some room for correspondence to the world in pragmatist theory, as far as I could see, but that's usually like in James, it's really confined to experience, so radical empiricism. So if you have objective truth, you can only have it about what you directly experience and what you can measure, what you can experiment with. And this kind of metaphysical truths or things like that, that's off limits. So as far as your statements correspond to what you experience, well, all right, you can call that correspondence, that's fine, but you don't get to have the metaphysics. And sometimes that seems to slide in verificationism. And verificationism is the view that meaning is only derived from experience. So if you have a word, it must be based on experience, and if it isn't, it's just meaningless. It's not even false. It's just, it doesn't mean anything. And that's extremely radical. And I would say currently it's rejected by basically all philosophers. It was popular early 20th century. But that does, yeah, if you look at James, for example, that really does seem to go in that direction, that meaning and truth is just confined to sense experience, and that anything that's above that is just not, well, either irrelevant or empty, just meaningless. So because if you define things in action, so truth is action, then you don't. If you, for example, say something like God exists, then it's the actions that define the meaning of
That's right.
God exists. So God exists doesn't mean God exists. It means going to church,
That's right.
praying, reading the Bible.
Right.
That's what it means.
That's
And it
right.
doesn't have metaphysical significance or anything. That just and the realist would say, well, you're just ignoring metaphysics, and that's the battle there. Because I mean, if you think there is an objective world, then yeah, it kind of does seem like you're ignoring something. And the pragmatist just, well, yeah, you can't know anything about it anyway. So that's the skepticism part. Yeah, sure. We don't know the objective reality. We don't even know there is any of that. The Ding an sich is a Kantian notion for the things as they really are. And the pragmatists say, well, who cares about that? It's not relevant. I need certain truths or certain beliefs so I can do the things I need to do.
Right.
And some kind of objective reality I can't even know. I mean, what does that matter? I mean, it just doesn't make any difference in action.
Right. Right. Well, and when you get to Peterson and his non-church going and his questions about belief in God, I mean, this is kind of, if I have a conversation with him someday, this is probably where I'm gonna poke around with him, because say, okay, well, what is your God? And because obviously as a pastor, I have these kinds of conversations with, well, I don't believe I need a church to believe in God. Okay, well, what does that mean? And well, then you can flip it over onto the church people and say, well, why do you go to church if you believe in God? Well, and actually psychologically, there's a lot of that's just simply, why do you put up a Christmas tree? Because it doesn't feel like Christmas unless I put up a Christmas tree. Well, what does the Christmas tree mean? Well, I don't know what it means, but I just put it up. And so then you get into these questions, these psychological questions of knowledge and behavior. And I think part of what's interesting about Peterson is that Peterson, more than most, tends to like to tie all of this stuff, not just in terms of psychology, but loves to tie it to philosophy, ties it to metaphysics. And, you might say, well, he shouldn't cross these lines. And he's like, should? It's fun. Why not? And
it works.
It works for me. It's obviously working for him. So,
and it's working for a lot of people too. I mean,
that's right.
He's doing fantastic. And
that's right.
So yeah, and what you see is then that you do run into trouble when you get a realist and a pragmatist together. So that happened with the Harris Peterson thing. That usually they agree. I mean, most of the things are often based on sense experience. They are quite logical. We just agree on that. It just doesn't make sense to deny them. And then you have no problem. But especially when you get to the more metaphysical terrain, then you do get differences of opinion. And what philosophers do when you have different theories of the same concept, say truth, you try to show that they, if, for example, if you have truth, so your definition of truth needs to range from all possible instances of true statements and none other. So if there is a statement that isn't true and it is true in your definition, then your theory is bad. And in the reverse, if there's a statement that is true but it's false in your definition, or then your theory is wrong. So that's what Harris was doing. And at some point, you pragmatists really get into trouble, because you have to deny things like the tree that's falling and making a sound. You have to deny things that, like, well, it didn't work, therefore it must be false. And then the intuitive realist, I mean, I think we all have some kind of intuitive realist, or at least most people, and say, well, that doesn't really make a lot of sense. That seems to be a counterexample, but because we feel like this is true, that's our intuition, but your theory says it's false. Well, yeah, I mean, pragmatism comes with, you really have to agree to some very counterintuitive claims. That's part of the deal, and that's one drawback of pragmatism.
Yeah, and it's no, it's well said. It's well said.
Yeah, and I mean, you get in philosophy, in contemporary philosophy, you have different theories of truth. Redundancy theory says you don't need truth. That's funny. Deflationary theories say, well, truth is not what you think it is. You can deflate it so that it's less. You commit yourself to less if you say something is true than people thought. And identity theory, I won't go into that, but you do have some more flavor. So it's not just two possible theories like pragmatism and realism.
Right.
You can have some more.
Right.
And that's just very complicated, and we won't need to go into that, but it's good points. So, and then we can go on.
All right. So next slide 4, Peterson on truth.
Yeah. So you had an interview. I also watched it, and it's a very good interview, I think, and he really shows his pragmatist side there. I think if you listen to that interview,
Which interview are you talking about?
The transliminal interview.
Transliminal 2015. Yeah.
Yes, that's right. So I got the quotations from it on the slides, some of the important quotations, and in these quotations, you really see that he is a metaphysical pragmatist. So he really seems to be a pragmatist, not just about what you do or the things that matter to you, but really also about more metaphysical claims that are farther away from direct experience. So God and things like that, and materialism, those kind of things. He really is a pragmatist, as far as I can tell here on this interview. And so he says, well, it's true enough if you act it out or hold it. So that's the action idea. So, and he quotes Nietzsche, says, truth serves life. So just like knowledge serves life, truth also serves lives. And his personal flavor of pragmatism is survival and reproduction. So over long spans of time, that's an important addition. And yeah, I mean, it's expressed, truth is expressed in action. That's also, I mean, we saw it already. And the consequences of your belief, that's what determines the truth. And it also means, for example, this is such a counterintuitive claim. He says, well, our detailed knowledge about the material world, it has not been tested from a Darwinian perspective. So it hasn't been tested in the sense that, does it make us more successful in survival and reproduction? Does modern science do that over long spans of time? It does over short spans of times, but who knows what's going to happen in the coming few centuries, for example. I mean, if we blow up each other, then it turns out it wasn't true after all, and that does seem very counterintuitive, and that's just why the realists like Mr. Rationality are just baffled. I think that doesn't make any sense, right? And
you're using your words wrong.
yeah, and it all goes back to the divide between pragmatism and realism, and that's just a very deep metaphysical disagreement, and that ends up translating in these differences of opinion. And it's important to see that it's not dishonest to be a pragmatist. People sometimes think that, and I'm sure there are dishonest pragmatists, just like there are dishonest realists, but it is a serious philosophical view, and there are arguments for it, and you don't, I mean, you can also just be confused instead of dishonest. I mean, there's so many options, and
that's right.
Maybe you were inconsistent, for example. I mean, that's all possible, and pragmatism does seem to be quite coherent, but you do have to accept some weird claims. And well, yeah, he also says, well, like realist truth is basically dangerous. So that's the nihilism or authoritarianism thing. He really equates realism with the science-based materialist realism, and that's, I think that's a mistake. That is not necessarily, it's a false dilemma, because you have Newtonian materialistic and reductionistic against Darwinian or pragmatist, but you can also have different flavors of realism. So you can have non-reductionistic realism, like many philosophers right now, and you can also have, for example, theistic, non-reductionistic, supernaturalism, what you could say. So, and they are still realists. So it's kind of a false dilemma. You can't really call them Newtonian in the sense that they believe in materialism, because that's just not true. And the others, on the other hand, they're really not pragmatists either.
Yeah. It's interesting. You know, truth and goodness always come together with your Aquinas. You know, was that Aquinas that said that? You know, and so.
I mean, that's very interesting. So a parallel I noticed, because Aquinas is a theory of transcendental. So you had the idea of being, and being what exists. It is one, it is true, and it is good. And those are the transcendentals. And so Aquinas argued that everything that exists is good, and it is true. And Aquinas also had the phrase that truth means adequatio rei et intellectus, which is Latin for correspondence of the intellect with the thing. So that's the correspondence theory, basically. And he said, well, so the point was also that evil has no independent existence. So this Manichaean theory is like evil against goodness, and there are two forces battling it out. That's not true. Goodness, everything that exists is good because God has made it. And Peterson seems to go kind of in that direction, because he really couples truth and goodness. That was just very interesting to me. Because I knew Aquinas' philosophy, and he shares the faith in the goodness of being, and that's brave. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, well, and it's interesting because, you know, when you look at Peterson's pragmatic definition of truth, you can see, you know, how that seems to look like Aquinas's definition of truth. And then you get into, say, Aquinas and, you know, Augustine with their ideas about evil, and, you know, evil as, you know, it's always it's not created, it's a distorted, or it's a diminished, or it's very interesting how, you know, how these people who should be in radically different camps, you think Jordan Peterson and Thomas Aquinas, but, you know, they start sounding alike, and it's kind of like, well, that's interesting.
Are they both saints? Well, Aquinas is, but yeah. but it is kind of the interesting thing is that Peterson basically makes his point, but he feels compelled to use a pragmatic theory to still believe this. So Aquinas, of course, is famous for his proofs of God, and so he really is a realist. But Peterson says, well, that's not my cup of tea, and then I'm not sure why he isn't a realist, but I think Mr. Rationality is in a sense on the money there, that Peterson wants to preserve the world of morality and religion and meaning, and he feels that pragmatism does a better job of helping people, like giving people good tools to work in the world, and then you don't really have to make the metaphysical arguments like Aquinas did, which are not very popular anymore. I mean, whether that's justified or not is a different topic, but that's kind of how it works.
Yep. No, I think it's fascinating that you put Aquinas, you know, in there. It's an interesting observation.
Let's go to the next one, I think.
Okay, so slide 5.
Yeah. The interesting thing is that there does seem to be something weird about Peterson's position in the different ways he talks about it, because the first quote, that is just metaphysical pragmatism at its finest. I mean, the environment is finally incomprehensible, so metaphysical truth, forget about it. You can't predict it, you can't know it, and limited creature like us that has access to sufficient truth enough to survive and reproduce. So, and there is no truth past that, and that's
right.
Important. There
That was
is
the money
no
quote.
past that, and that's extremely radical, for example. And if you if you just see the world as made out of action, for example, as the second quote, then you can talk about that kind of truth, but it does imply at the same time that if it doesn't show up in the world of action, then it isn't real. Actually, it seems like it's just irrelevant, or maybe meaningless, or just, I mean, and that's just very pragmatist, and it seems to contradict sometimes with other things he says, and that's kind of what Mr. Rationality, I think, also was getting at, is that there does seem to be a sort of um, um, a confusion, or maybe an inconsistency, or something there that is causing the things to create, for example, contradictions like, well, is it true or not? Yes, it's true, but it's also not true in the kind of metaphorical sense. And the idea that there are different kinds of truths and different levels, or things like that, that's a kind of a dangerous and confusing idea. I mean, William James seems to have tried to do that, but the thing is, if truths from different levels start to contradict each other, you're no longer really talking about truths. And because all truth is one, you can't contradict it yourself and still claim that everything you say is true.
Right.
So so I think it's quite important to stick to just one definition of truth, and you can be pragmatist about that, but that does mean you have to swallow some things, and you can't have your cake and eat it too, I think. And that's, sometimes it seems like Peterson is trying to do that.
Yeah, and it's interesting to me too, because there isn't any truth past that, but I think inherent in a lot of Peterson's arguments, for example, his argument about sacrifice, that a thoroughgoing contemporary American pragmatist might say that animal sacrifice is an exceedingly pragmatic thing to do. You're taking this perfectly good animal and you're burning the whole thing up because you imagine a guy in the sky enjoys the smell of it. Now, Peterson is making an argument that says, no, this is an incredibly pragmatic thing. He doesn't even know why he's doing it. He's acting it out. It's in Peterson's accent, it's drama. And he, and then Peterson making the argument that, in a sense, the little men inside your head, this little committee that is us, not the conscious self, but all these unconscious selves who are watching and learning, pretty quickly over time, we figured out that, oh, people who sacrifice do better than people who don't. So now you're making an argument that, well, there's in a sense a pragmatism beyond our conscious ability to grasp pragmatism. And that, people who do crazy things like go to church or sacrifice their goats, or there was an article recently where they couldn't get this jetliner off the ground, so these Buddhists went out there and they sacrificed a goat on the runway, and now we can take off. Well, okay, what isn't there any truth past, and can we know it, and how does that work? So it's, I think, perhaps the question of Jordan Peterson. One question is, if you look at, say, the current affairs article, say, well, is he right? Well, I don't know. Then the next question is, well, why are we so interested in him? Well, that's a really interesting question. And is it because he's just got some flat contradictions that he's unwilling to admit, but he's just so really capable of talking, and he's got all these cool ideas up in the air that we're fascinated by the bright, shiny things he's managing to juggle before our eyes? I mean, which is it? So I don't know. I haven't figured it out, but I'm still, it's interesting. So I still work at it. Those are my watchers.
Yeah, if you for example, take the idea of metaphorical truth that comes up, and that's very interesting, because something can be literally false and metaphorically true. So, for example, if I say that it's currently raining cats and dogs outside, and that's not really true, is it? It is true, but not literally. So what do you make of that? Do you create two different kinds of truth? And the idea in philosophy has been that if you have something that's purely metaphorical, you can paraphrase it in a better way to show its meaning without using the metaphor. So if you, for example, say that it's raining cats and dogs, then what you really mean is that, well, it's currently raining heavily outside. And that statement is true. And the metaphorical statement is basically the literal statement, but just using a metaphor. So it's true, and you can show that because you have a literally true paraphrase. Literally true is not the great word. Objectively true. Let's keep it at that.
Except, well, then C.S. Lewis wades in on that and says, well, you've changed cats and dogs to heavily. You've actually just exchanged metaphors. Now you might say, well, it has rained in American standards, rained 2.5 inches. I don't know how many centimeters that would be, 6 centimeters. It's rained 6 centimeters in the last hour. Okay, so we're saying, well, that's literal truth. And now we're getting back into Peterson realms, because we say, well, where did it rain 6 centimeters? Well, over, in Sacramento terms, over at Executive Airport, which is near me. Well, where exactly on Executive Airport? Because the clouds went overhead, a mile the other way, it only rained 4 centimeters. So, and now we're getting then into the question of representations. So then I think Peterson in a sense throws all this stuff up at us and says, your systems. And this is, again, where he's with the pragmatist saying, I'm not so sure.
Can you
tell me what you do. Did you put up an umbrella or not?
Oh, in the philosophers, just they quibble about whether you can really paraphrase everything, and sometimes it seems to require something else. So you got Platonism, for example, that if you can paraphrase away a certain statement, then they do need to exist, and as a sort of Platonic object. So that's one of the, and then I mean that's totally not pragmatist. So what a pragmatist, for example, should say, a consistent metaphysical pragmatist. So you for example, you have reincarnation and heaven, right?
Right.
And they both work. So, and they seem to contradict each other. How is that possible? So the pragmatist can say, well, if the actions they lead to are the same, then there isn't even a contradiction. Because what
Uh-huh.
it means is how you act on it. And if you act on it, if you act on superficially different statements the same way, then the real meaning of both statements is just the same. And
Right.
so there is no contradiction between heaven and reincarnation if both of the things work. If they lead to the same result, then they're both true, and there isn't even any contradiction, because the only reason you feel there is a contradiction is because you are still an intuitive realist, and you shouldn't be that.
You shouldn't be that. Oh,
Well, from
a
the
true
pragmatic
pragmatist would
point of
say,
view.
40 virgin reincarnation, a particular kind, Dante's heaven where you've got the beatific vision. Doesn't matter as long as, you don't shoot your neighbor to take his car. Yeah.
That's and then I mean that's just again very counterintuitive, and sometimes it seems like, well, I mean you can just, the idea then here is that I mean reincarnation, is it true? So you really should see it as a tool. That's again the pragmatic way of looking at it. So reincarnation is true in the sense that it is a good tool. It does what it's supposed to do. So if you say, well, they're both good tools, that they look different but they do the same thing, and well, what's your problem? They're tools after all, so what do you care actually?
Right. And so then when you say listen to Jordan Peterson's biblical series, when you're listening to him talk about his hierarchies and the idea of God, the details of that God up there, we can be flexible on those. And the way that we read the Bible about that God up there, your pragmatism is going to impact how you read that Bible. And so for Peterson, the takeaway from let's say some of the stories of Genesis would be, don't confuse your current instantiation with the guy at the top of your hierarchy with the idea of God, because you must always have someone, the king must be accountable to someone. And so, for example, when you read the stories of the kings of Israel and you read about Ahab blowing off the prophets of Yahweh versus the prophets that tell him what he wants to hear, pragmatically, you have stumbled across the line. But whether this God at the top is, recycling us through reincarnation or sending us up to heaven or whatever he's doing, doesn't matter as long as we get this thing going correctly here.
We win the war, for
That's right.
example. Yeah. And just a point to help the pragmatist a little bit here is that you don't need, I mean, reincarnation and heaven do not have exactly the same result. I mean, the actions you do when you believe in reincarnation and heaven are different. And maybe they lead to survival and reproduction, but probably at different rates, maybe, or in different circumstances. And so it's a little bit too easy to say, well, they're just exactly the same for the pragmatist, because if you really look at the behavior, the action, that the meaning, the pragmatist meaning in the action, those are not exactly the same. So it's a little bit too easy to say, well, if you're a pragmatist, you have to believe in Santa Claus exists because well, that just works. And the pragmatist can just say, well, no, it doesn't. if you believe in Santa Claus and you act it out, and then people are going to laugh at you, and you're going to get forgotten because there are no presents under the Christmas tree because there is no Santa Claus. And in the same way, for example, if you think that climate change or global warming isn't real, I mean, that if you look at it, you don't have to say, well, if that works, then it's true. But the point is, it doesn't work, not in the long run. So being a pragmatist doesn't commit you to crazy, just stupid, false statements like Santa Claus exists or things like that. And you can argue about climate skepticism. That's not the point here. But the idea is here, pragmatism is not relativism. So it's not just anything goes.
Right.
And then
Right.
that might make it a little bit more plausible if you want to swallow those counterintuitive claims. That they're not all that counterintuitive as some people make it seem.
Yep. 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 No, good. Good. I think that's helpful.
Yeah, and you wait. I still want to say one thing about the previous one. Yeah, um, that's about the issue of is Peterson consistent, because he does talk about metaphysics and he says, well, I'm not sure, I don't know, but he leaves open the idea of learning about it, and that doesn't really seem to be compatible with full-blown pragmatism, because that kind of Jamesian pragmatism just says, well, it just doesn't matter. It's irrelevant. It doesn't mean anything. And if you say that the entire question, for example, of the resurrection or things like that, or they just don't they don't make any sense, and he seems to be open to, he wants to leave open the metaphysical questions, but what his pragmatism seems to demand is not that he leaves it open, but that he cuts it off, and that there is no truth past action. So it's a pity
Yeah.
for you, but you can't go there. And he does seem to want to go there, and I'm not sure if that's really consistent.
Yeah. Well, and at the same time, I could understand leaving it open in terms of, well, if it, the arguments, certain camps of Christianity like to get into the question of evidence for the resurrection. Can we, with historical tools, give us reason to believe in the resurrection of Jesus? Some Christian camps look at that and say, no, it's by faith. That's a completely opposite thing. But the camps that want to demonstrate it with historical tools, for example,
Correct.
if you can, if you believe in the resurrection on the basis of that, well, suddenly resurrection and reincarnation have very different implications in terms of how one might want to live now. For example, you could, for a long time, Christians were debating cremation versus burial. There's a pragmatic result of the conversation. There are emotional and cultural and cultic, in terms of rituals. Which rituals do you perform? How do those rituals impact us psychologically? And this is where Peterson, as a psychologist, gets very interesting in this, because part of what happened after Freud was that in at least within certain communities, religion became a therapeutic practice. And part of the way that, say, the modernists wanted to rescue the Bible and religion from Darwin and what others found was, well, let's make it completely therapeutic. And then kind of what happened when you work that all the way through the end was this loss of realism, a succumbing to complete pragmatism. And then the pragmatists, pragmatism in a sense is always based on, again, a certain view of the world. And it's, as you noted, it's based on desires. This is good enough, but you can't stop. Good enough for what? What is the objective? What is the outcome? What is the end? So it's interesting that perhaps some of what we're seeing in Peterson that looks inconsistent is we're in a sense reaching some of the limits of pragmatism, and then it's wandering over into where we're not quite sure yet, but maybe that's
we're going back to
Peterson.
Back to realism, I think.
Yeah, could be.
It just, the pull still, it just keeps pulling, and you get some more philosophical issues, for example, like the only thing on the slide that I haven't talked about yet. Well, if you talk about things that work and action that works, well, who decides what works? What is the definition of working?
That's right. That's right.
And for who? And you can easily conceive of groups that have completely different views of that, and it doesn't seem self-evident to pick just survival and reproduction. That those are evolutionary goals in the sense that
That's right.
the theory of evolution talks about, but that's a description of the process, and it's not prescriptive. It doesn't say what you ought to do, and so Peterson does have to justify his pragmatist criterion, and it's not evident that he just gets that done easily. That there really are some difficult questions you have to answer about. When is something good tool? When is something useful? Useful for who? In what circumstances? And there seems a lot of potential for contradictions and difficulties there to justify the pragmatic theory of truth. And that's the thing that professional philosophers love to talk about. Well, you got to flesh that out. You got to make strict definitions and counterexamples and that entire process, and that is pretty difficult. But I mean, most philosophical theories have this problem, so I don't want to say, well, that's just the end of pragmatism. But you do have, I mean, Peterson's starting point is not self-evident, and it needs to be justified, and that's going to be difficult.
Yeah. Well, and this gets into, in a sense, also the medium in which Peterson has arisen, which is YouTube. You know, you and I now via this little video have access to a level of visibility that just 50 years ago would simply be unfathomable. That here we have a pastor of an insignificant church and a graduate student of a university.
No one knows about.
Yeah, you know, we could just be, we're just talking on here, but doggone it, people are going to listen to us, and you know, does it mean anything? So Peterson's on the web. You know, this gets into the current affairs article and their criteria. He's just out there talking, and you know, here I know something because I'm the editor of this publication, and I say this is a bunch of hooey. But David Brooks, who is, you know, has status, now we're into the hierarchies. He has status, and David Brooks says, no, he's one of the most important intellectuals of our time. Well, which is it?
Yeah, I do think, I mean, this is one of the questions I had before just making this whole thing. I thought, well, I don't want just to give my opinion. So I really stuck to the philosophical theory, and yeah, I will give some sources at the end where you can look things up, and so, and if you're really interested, you should probably buy this book, Metaphysics. It's pretty good, I think.
And neither of us are making any money on the sale of this book.
No, that's right. And so yeah, so we can go to the next slide. I should really wrap up soon. This is just getting too long, but the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy is really a good source. It's written by the best philosophers in every specialization. You get the world's finest that write for it, and
you get those at the top of the dominance hierarchy.
Yes,
or the competence hierarchy.
Yeah, at least. So to wrap up this stuff, what do you? Professional philosophers are just in a different world. It seems sometimes they aren't on YouTube mostly, but they have thought these things through pretty well. And the what you can take away from it is that philosophical arguments are usually not decisive. So there still remains a lot of disagreement in philosophy. So the old complaint that philosophy makes no progress is still somewhat heard. And I don't think it's fair, because there is progress, but there's no consensus on most substantive issues. So, and when you get to metaphysics, that's especially the case, because it's so abstract, it is so difficult to grasp, to understand. And when I just, for example, the videos about truth and things like that, you see all kinds of confusion and bad arguments in the comments, and you can't help yourself. I mean, I probably made a bad argument here and there without even knowing it. So you need to be cautious with accusing people of dishonesty, or thinking that you've just settled the matter once and for all because you had this intuitive argument. So you could call that a rationalist delusion. And I think that's a very interesting term from Jonathan Haidt. And I really think that's true. You do need to be careful in philosophical debates, because you don't understand all the details of these discussions. And pragmatism, it really does seem implausible, and it has its limits, but it doesn't mean means that it's completely untenable. And at the same time, it is out of fashion. There are very few professional philosophers left who defend epistemic theories, so anti-realist theories. There are quite some left, but they're the minority. I think that there was a survey a few years back, and that said that mainly like over 50% of analytic philosophers had a correspondence theory of truth, and some 25% more had a realist-friendly deflationary view. So what you see in current contemporary philosophy is that philosophers really turn back to common sense after logical positivism and verificationism in 20th century. Metaphysics is bad. Epistemology is very commonsensical. You start with common sense knowledge claims, and then you go from there. So people aren't as impressed as they were with skeptical arguments. There are a lot of counter arguments to the traditional skeptic hypotheses, and etc. So that also means that the problems of realism aren't considered to be that bad anymore. So philosophers just think that pragmatism or anti-realism, they have way too many problems, and we can deal with the skeptic, but the pragmatist, that's just they just don't think that's going to they just think that it has more problems, and realism is quite intuitive. It conforms to common sense, which does have its weight in philosophy, rightly so. You can't just shake all these kinds of rationalist arguments out of your head and think, well, this disproves common sense, therefore I'm right. That's just too easy. You do need to be careful. And at the same time, metaphysics is also back. Philosophers are busy with time, with space, with the universe, with the multiverse, with God, with scientific entities like quarks and those things. Really, there are big discussions about those things. So philosophy is quite realist right now, and like there are kind of patterns and historical developments. I mean, who knows what's going to be in 50 years? You can't say, well, the philosophers right now think that this and this and this, so therefore that's true. But what you do see, well, is that philosophy is just very realist and naturalistic as well, as I said. Well, as I put down there, and they're just very impressed with science. So, but scientific realism again. So science tells us about the real world, and at the same time, you can also be a Christian philosopher. And for example, Peter van Inwagen is one of the best metaphysicians in the world. He's retired now, but he was a Christian. Was he Catholic? I'm not sure. Maybe he was. Alvin Plantinga, of course, and you have many more. So at the same time, you can't say that God is dead in philosophy. So and if you're a Christian, well, most of them also tend to be realists, and they do think. For Craig is a great example. You really, but Plantinga and Van Inwagen and Richard Swinburne from England, they're all realists, and because pragmatism just has its metaphysical problems, and if you count out skepticism, then it just makes more sense, and you also want to say that Jesus really rose from the dead. You really want to say that God created the universe. And that's not something that works. Well, it does work as well if you express it in action, but it's also really true. And to say that, you need to be a realist.
Well, it's God can be any kind of pragmatist he wants, it seems. Um, and so then you get to, it was very interesting that Rationality Rules pulled out that quote from Brett Weinstein, which basically is asserting that the biggest nest wins. So your biggest nest is the top of your hierarchy. And this again gets into the question of, well, God, you get into archetypal language. God, you can't get beyond God. You've got a being that is omniscient, omnipotent, omnipresent. You can't get bigger than all. If you get bigger than all, then you have a new all, and then you're stuck with a Greek God instead of a Christian God, and so off we go with that. Well, this was very helpful. I found it helpful, and I hope those who watch find it helpful. And I'm sure people will engage in the comment section from this. There'll be lots of ideas. So go ahead and wade in on the comments.
I will, and I apologize for the length. I tried to be to make it shorter, but I'm not sure how long we were running. But I suppose we should cut it off quickly.
This was very good. So I really appreciate you taking the time and really taking the time to write out these outlines. And I left them on the screen big, so I'm sure people will go back over them and look at them. One of the amazing things that I've really appreciated from this whole adventure in my life has been, the people who watch this and their comments. I have learned so much from the people and their comments. And it's just, this is an amazing tool. And yeah, we might just be a pastor and a graduate student, but who cares? This has been tremendously helpful to me, and fun to be in conversation and to build relationships and to get to know people. So I don't know if that's a realist or a pragmatic argument, but heck, I like it. So maybe it's hedonistic.
Yeah, we can be pragmatic realists, I would say. You really care about it. I mean, that criticism of academic philosophy is warranted. That it's usually so so arcane and so disconnected from anything that really matters to us. It's not entirely true, but in many cases it seems to be. And philosophers would be wise to listen to that and to try to make their work as relevant as they can. And personally, I've also just learned a lot by just figuring things out and reading about them. And you have so many good sources now. It's just amazing that how much you can learn online. And I do have my philosophy background, which just makes things much easier, because for example, the Stanford Encyclopedia can be extremely technical and difficult to understand. But just the experience of learning so many new things is just great, and an extraordinary opportunity in historical perspective, I would say.
Well, if if the philosophers get really good at explaining themselves, you put the pastors out of business, because pastors we're intermediaries. We take this knowledge up here and we try to apply it into people's lives, and it's part of how this entire system works, and we all have our roles to play in it. So
and then Peterson, he's a pragmatist, and that's the reason he went viral, I think. You do need to be to talk about things that concern people and that they care about, and just be a realist, I would say, or if you really want to, a pragmatist. But if you care, if you talk about the things that are really important that people care about, you will have good and useful conversations. And I hope this one was one of those.
All right. Well, thank you, and stay on, because I'll just pause the recording here and then we'll wrap up. Yeah. So thank you, Roland, and go ahead. Anybody who watches this, if you have a question, Roland, you'll be in the comment section and watching for comments. Do you have a handle, or is it your same name?
At least my first name, or not my first name, the other one. Yes, so you will recognize me. Yes, I'm just
Okay.
Roland.
Okay, so feel free to engage Roland in the comment section, and thank you all for watching.